All right, this is CS50, and this is CS50's Office Hours. Welcome to everyone who's joining us live via YouTube. If you haven't already, please feel free to say hello to everyone else who's in the chat at the moment and where you are in the world. If you're watching this on demand afterwards, feel free to comment with the same, if only to engage all the more with CS50's community and meet classmates from around the world. So these office hours, as you might recall, are an opportunity for folks in CS50's several classes to ask questions of me, of CS50's other team members, including a super special team member who used to be here in person with us in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but a few years back moved far away to Las Vegas, Nevada to start off on his own. And I'm so happy to welcome back to CS50 Circle, CS50's own Colton Ogden.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been a long time. The last time we did one of these was, what, I want to say maybe in 2020. Did we have something that we briefly did?
It's a few years ago. Yeah, we would have done it probably during COVID on Zoom or such. And Colton, for those less familiar, was actually really the architect of some of our first live streams on a Twitch platform. And Colton, do you want to tell folks about that and how you started that?
Yeah, that was an offshoot, I think, of actually, it originally was a CS50 office hours type thing that you and I did. I think you were primarily doing all of the work in the content for that. And then we called that CS50 Live, and then that turned into the video production stuff. And then eventually we brought it back, and we repurposed the name CS50 Live for the new sort of free-form coding educational content that we started doing on Twitch, because Twitch was becoming a lot more popular at the time.
Yeah, and those were pretty long form. You would go for like an hour, 2, 3 hours, like walking people through coding projects from start to finish.
Yeah, it was a bit. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but yeah, it was a bit longer form content.
It was, and that was kind of before. I mean, some of these platforms are around, but I think even since you were doing that like 5-ish years ago, I feel like these other video platforms, Instagram, TikTok, Reels on YouTube, have kind of blown up in a way they hadn't yet a few years back.
Yeah, no, Instagram, especially the live stories on that. And I mean, Snapchat existed at the time, but I don't think people were using it too much. And I don't know if people are even using it that much today. But Instagram for sure. I mean, Instagram's blown up a lot, I feel like.
Yeah, no, for sure. Now, Colton, of course, teaches CS50G, or CS50, or GD50, as he likes to call it, for Game Development 50, which is an introduction to game development using 2D graphics and also 3D graphics. That's a class you can still take, anyone watching this online, at cs50.edx.org/games. But Colton is now also in the real world. And Colton, do you want to share what you've been up to since you left Cambridge?
Yeah, no. So in 2019, I went to Japan for a few months to do a sort of a startup project. Came back to California, where my parents were, and then moved to Nevada to work for a company called From Zero LLC. And they create the From Zero brand of educational textbooks for language. And they teach Japanese and Korean. There's Spanish, German, and Chinese in the works as well. And they had a site that they needed to get redone. So FromZero.com, which is it used to be YesJapan.com. And I was into Japanese, still am into Japanese, and so I sort of gravitated towards helping them out. And to this day, yeah, I'm the CTO and sort of lead developer on their website.
Nice. So do you mind sharing, like, what is it actually like to be a full-time software engineer in the real world?
Yeah, no, certainly. So a lot of it, especially recently, has been a bit more on the. So one thing I think that I've come to appreciate is factors that go into scalability and
Okay.
maintainability. So I feel like when you're learning programming a lot of the time, the focus is, I want to learn a particular language, I want to solve these particular problems. But then when you're actually working on a code base that's hundreds of thousands of lines of code or more, you start to run into issues with scaling the code out and testing it, making sure it's stable. And so test-driven development becomes extremely important. DevOps becomes extremely important. Making sure that team members can easily get up and running and spinning, everything up using something like Docker, which I wasn't super familiar with going into stuff, and now it's like one of my favorite things. There's a lot of work that goes into not just strictly the programming side of stuff, which I think is something that you appreciate more and more, especially the testing. Test-driven development is something that is really important to me now, way more than it ever was prior to working on something of that kind of scale.
And what does that mean? Like in some university circles, some courses are taught that way, where you write tests first and then actually write the code. But what does it mean for you in the real world?
So test-driven development is exactly that, and it takes a few different forms. So with the web, it's interesting because you have, and this has been around for a long time, Selenium and Cypress, these sort of drivers that actually will guide the web browser and control it like a human will, and test for things existing in the DOM. That's one way of doing testing. So that would be end-to-end testing, where you're actually testing something from start to finish as an end user would be doing it. And then you have things
Hmm.
like unit and integration testing, which is, I think, what a lot of courses teach more so when it comes to test-driven development, where you're actually testing individual pieces of code or those pieces of code coming together. Um, and there's also when you're dealing with server stuff and something that's super cool. So I work on a MERN stack, Mongo Express React Node um, web application, and it's really important to be able to test the API in a way that models more or less how the browser would use it as well in sort of this test-driven way. And
Hmm.
so there's a library called Supertest, which is great for that. And so you can actually send API requests. Yeah, it's a funny name, but it's a really
It's better
good
than test,
library.
as I imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's the next iteration of that. But it's nice because you can model API interactions just like you would using it from a browser, and whatever type of HTTP request you want to use, whatever data you want to send, sending
Huh.
cookies to model a session, etc. So all this, there's all these different ways of testing that are cool, but it's a combination of all of them that come together that let you sort of know with high likelihood that your application is a lot more stable than just kind of going through and naively sort of testing it as a human and neglecting all these various sort of contingencies.
And so to be clear, you're writing the tests in advance so that you know whatever code you then write is correct.
Exactly, yeah. Starting with essentially the test as if you had already written the code, but the
Okay.
code's not actually written yet. So you're sort of saying, I expect this to be true, and you're in your head kind of thinking ahead a little bit of where you know that the code is going to exist, like what you
Okay.
what you know is going to exist in the DOM if you're writing an end-to-end Cypress test, or what routes will exist in your Express app if you're trying to test your API, or whatever functions that you assume are going to exist that do services on the back end that are separate from the actual controllers that are tied into the routes, all this stuff. Some of this might be a little arcane to some of the audience who might not have necessarily done a web application before, but the gist being overall that you start with the end in mind and you assume that it exists and you build failing tests deliberately because the code's not written yet, but then you work your way backwards by implementing the things that should work, that should exist, such that you do eventually have a functioning test suite in as far as it passes and all the code is implemented for it.
It's funny. I haven't really thought about it this way, but that's kind of the environment we create within CS50X itself, insofar as we give students Check 50 tests that we, to be fair, wrote in advance. And if they try running Check 50 on their empty mario.c file, like it's going to fail all of the tests, but they are in fact all written in advance. And as they work through their problem set, theoretically, by the time they submit, they will have now passed all of those tests. But the difference between proper TDD or test-driven development is that we, the staff, are writing these tests, not the students themselves. So maybe the final project would really be students' first opportunity if they were to want to write tests of their own using either Check 50 or something more industry standard, because the final project is not something that we have designed for them. So they could write tests for their final project and then implement their final project.
Yeah, does CS50, is that something that CS50 currently does where the final project expects them to write tests for it?
It isn't. I mean, it's a big enough lift, I think, for folks to go from being handed a specification for piece set 0 through 9, and then having no specification and having to do it on their own. And we definitely don't have time in the term or allocate time during the term to teach any unit testing frameworks or the like. So I think
Sure.
it's an opportunity. But maybe that helps give people a mental model for like how test-driven development fits into what it is they are doing when they're with us in our ecosystem, at least.
Is test-driven development taught in CS50's web course by chance? I'm not sure
Oh,
if I recall if that's the case or not.
Not right on the head like that, I would say. Like there's a tradition of testing within the course, but not so much what you're describing. I mean, it's
I see.
interesting when we have gone, some of CS50 team, to a computer science conference called SIGSE, the Special Interest Group on Computer Science Education. You actually get a taste of how other high schools, how other universities are actually teaching coding, and TDD, test-driven development, is kind of one of the paradigms that some faculty like really like and teach their entire course that way, even from the beginning. That's not something that's necessarily resonated with me, but I do suppose we're sort of, creating the framework for that just by way of having our own Check 50 stuff. So we could probably introduce it if we wanted to by having students write their own Check 50 checks to maybe supplement the ones we do, though. But haven't really thought hard on that before.
I hadn't considered CS50, I, of course, being familiar with Check50 in the past, I hadn't really considered that that was essentially what you were doing. But yeah, it is
Yeah.
essentially test-driven development in a sort of different, indirect way. But yeah, it
Yeah,
is.
except we're doing that half of the development as opposed to the students. But yeah. Well, I always, Colton, hold you up as like this voice of authority, and for the past couple of years, as GitHub Copilot and AI has kind of been taking over the conversation, and we have so many students, as you know, who are taking CS50X or courses like it to try to pivot, either to learn about the technology field, to maybe go into professional software development, to try to find better opportunities for themselves and their families. And I do think like all of the conversation around AI has been a little worrisome for a lot of people, insofar as it no longer seems like a sure thing that if you learn how to program, now you can go get a great job. But you are obviously like have a great job and you're doing full-time software engineering, but you're also using AI. And I always bring you up because you are the first friend of mine who was using GitHub Copilot, and you kind of swore by it so much that like it seemed worth paying for even, which kind of says something, I would think, about like its value. And at the risk of this now accidentally sounding like an advertisement, like, do you mind speaking to your experience in the real world with AI and code and how you think this is going to affect students in
Uh,
CS50's world?
yeah, absolutely. So GitHub Copilot, it is one of those things that's kind of scary, I think, to a lot of people that haven't used it for, a whole lot, and who especially are coming into the field of computer science right now when people are
Mm-hmm.
talking about AI and automation and all that stuff. Um, but it's it's hard to really encapsulate just how useful it is. There, because essentially you can use it to autocomplete anything. It's not even necessarily just purely for code. You can literally type a random text document and have it complete stuff. So for people unfamiliar, GitHub Copilot is an extension to VS Code, Visual Studio Code, where as you're typing something out in whatever file you want, it can be any file. I think it even it'll generate binary if you open up a binary file that's been unencrypted. Um, you can actually, so you'll see in line while you're typing, you'll see a suggestion for code, and you can press Control Enter to see 10 different suggestions, so you can get a sample of different solutions perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And this is great. First and foremost, for me, as I started looking at it, it was for boilerplate, because nobody really likes writing the same kind of functions, the same overall casing for a class if you're doing object-oriented programming or whatever. There's inevitably going to be cruft in whatever system you build that's not intellectually stimulating. It's just like something that has to get done so that you can proceed to the interesting stuff. And for me, that was the big sell right out the gate, because now I can just get rid of the things that were particularly uninteresting and just focus on things that are interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But it ties into more than that, because you also get into, like, we just had a conversation about testing. And automated tests tend to follow a pretty consistent format for the most part. And if you write out, so here's what you can do. You GitHub Copilot is essentially similar to ChatGPT. It's running off the same, like a slightly more primitive model than GPT-4, but it's running off of a similar model where it's feeding in text data tokens from your text editor into the model, and then that model is predicting what it should inject into your current text file. And so what you can do is you can give it a comment and say, hey, this is what I want to do. Please do this thing for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it can do anything in your actual code, obviously, but you can also use this to generate tests. So if you know that you have to write, I just finished writing a code file that was 1,400 lines of tests for one API route, and to do that by hand would have not been the most enjoyable thing in the world. But Copilot is able to generate one line of, or one test that might be 50 to 100 lines of code in just the blink of an eye based on the context that it already has from the other tests. It uses my exact style. It has all of the context of the libraries that I'm using and all of the functions that I've created, my helper functions, because I've used them in other places. So even though the test might be slightly different in several different places to have previously warranted needing to go through it, I can now generate a test in the span of like 3 seconds and then allow myself to get the job done that I need to get done and not spend the time during my day for hours and hours writing these tests. The goal, I think, at the end of the day should probably be to do the things that are interesting and move whatever your objective is forward, whether it's your company, whether it's your personal project. And testing is one of those things that you got to do to be stable and to make sure you don't upset people. But I don't think it's something that people want to spend all day doing. I think people typically want to spend time getting to the interesting problem solving. So
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I mean, I'll guiltily admit that I'm not a fan really of writing tests myself. And so the alternative to like not using something like that is just, well, just don't write the tests at all. But if it were more pleasant and just a lot easier to generate them, I should probably generate some similarly better habits myself. On this note, someone asked online, Colton, that I can channel here verbally. I have a habit, quote unquote, of correcting all of my code and relieving it from any nasty code smell using ChatGPT. Is that okay? I can answer that from CS50's perspective, at least for so far as problem sets are concerned. Like, as most folks know, like CS50's policy is that you should not use ChatGPT or similar tools only because they're too helpful and they'll sort of hand you the answer to a problem. And that's why, of course, we have the CS50 Duck instead, which is actually very similar in spirit. It's built on top of ChatGPT, literally its APIs, but it tries to lead you to writing better code rather than just telling you what to do. But Colton, if we fast forward out of CS50 to either people's final projects or like code in the real world, like what's your take on using something like ChatGPT to improve code you already wrote?
So I think ChatGPT is fantastic for this kind of purpose, but with the caveat that people should not use it as a crutch. They should not use it as a purely as a crutch that they don't understand the output from. I think it probably goes without saying, but I feel like anybody that uses ChatGPT to get something done but doesn't actually know what they're generating and why it's generating it the way that it's doing it is not doing themselves any favors with actually making themselves a better developer. They're just relying more and more on ChatGPT, which in the future that might be valid to the point where we get away from writing as much code and relying more on language models. But I think for the foreseeable future, people benefit the most when they can use GPT to get new iterations on what they're writing, but fully take in that information and use it properly, actually assimilate it and make it part of how you would develop if you didn't have a large language model to work off of, is my philosophy.
And I'll say too, I haven't really used ChatGPT for reviewing code I've written, but I kind of use it almost every day now when I'm either trying to like learn some new environment or language, or honestly some API where like there's probably, hopefully, API documentation, but it's just kind of annoying to go through it, and it's often written formally when really all I want is like some getting started code to copy paste and then kind of make my own. And so ChatGPT has been like pretty game changing for that, and it's kind of like an alternative, honestly, to like texting you, Colton, to ask questions, or some of CS50's other team members over the year, Brian and Tommy and other names that folks online might remember who are super smart and really good at this stuff. But like, there's only so many times I can text them in the middle of the day and expect them to unblock me, whereas ChatGPT is super helpful and happy to answer all of my questions endlessly. So it's kind of changed what I use, and I sort of reach to Google as like plan B, or if I want to like actually pull up the full-fledged documentation or like understand more richly some topic.
Yeah, no, it's at the risk of denigrating myself based on what you said. It's like having an intern always available to sort of pester and ask questions of. But I think it's actually, in a lot of ways, it's better because an intern, especially when he's relatively green, is probably going to have not always correct or great solutions. Whereas GPT-4, typically when I've used it for almost everything, it's been at the very minimum, it's been like acceptable within industry, if not really good. And I think that that is what makes it so powerful, is that we can, like you just mentioned, it's essentially like a very smart proxy to Google and Stack Overflow that knows exactly what to find in terms of the problem that you're trying to solve right now. And it saves you human time navigating a search engine or having to think about how to phrase your thoughts to properly manipulate the search engine to get you what you want, which was a skill I think especially prior to GPT-4, that was really useful, was being able to
Yeah.
Google really cleverly. But it is essentially like the next iteration on that, and I use it on a daily basis many, many times. It's not just for programming, it's universally applicable. I use it for trying to analyze and understand all kinds of things. If I'm reading something, if I'm trying to learn something, a language, if I'm trying to, in tech, also learn a completely new environment. Like I got into trying to learn a little bit of very low level, like Nintendo 64 development, and that brought me into writing an x86 bootloader in assembly, and most of that process was done via interacting with GPT-4 and asking questions about how everything worked. And in the end, I got it to work. And it
Oh
was
my God.
something I probably never would have been able to do or had the time or patience to do otherwise.
I think there's some newer consoles out there that you could develop games for.
I like the old stuff. I like the older stuff. It's my childhood.
I, yes, no, I do agree. The original NES, Nintendo Entertainment System, is still my favorite of them all, I do think. Huh. I will say, though, that it is true that even GPT-4, which is sort of like the better version of it lately than versus the default GPT 3.5, like it definitely makes mistakes. And I do think to preempt a question from folks online, like still actually studying the material and getting better code. To your point, Colton, about like actually not using it so much as a crutch so that you don't learn the material yourself is important. And case in point, like literally last night, I was trying to get a tool called RStudio Server up and working on some of CS50's infrastructure. And this is actually the graphical interface that Carter is going to be using in CS50R. CS50's new introduction to programming with R, which is a graphical IDE or integrated development environment that we're now trying to get working on CS50's code spaces online. And ChatGPT, I was asking it some question about like configuring it at the command line. And ChatGPT said something so confidently like, because RStudio Server runs on port 8787, you need to start the server using root or administrative privileges because the number is below 1024. I'm like, no, like literally 8,787 is larger than 1,024. And so it sort of says stupid things sometimes that maybe it learned, frankly, because some human misspoke some time ago. But I do think, at least for now, and probably for some amount of time, like you're going to have enough wherewithal not to just blindly copy paste things. And this has always been true, even of Stack Overflow. But I do think these tools, that said, will get better over time so that ideally it won't make mistakes and it'll be a rare thing for us humans to realize, no, that's not quite right.
Yeah, no, it's I think pretty essential, especially for folks that are earlier on learning programming, to have Google as a second source for a lot of this stuff. Like you have to build an intuition for what's right and what's wrong for a lot of this
Yeah.
stuff, and I don't think that that's going to be any easier for somebody just purely relying on GPT-4. Granted, it's correct much of the time, and it will get better and better, but it's still going to hallucinate, and it's still at the end of the day just probabilistic generation of text tokens. So
Yeah.
I don't think people are worried about losing programming jobs too. And like this software, depending on the risk of a lot of this software, it's going to still have to be vetted and checked by humans, and the humans are going to have to know the programming language because, you know, heaven forbid a piece of medical software results in something horrible and it was generated via some large language
Yeah.
model. I don't think that that's going to fly in the face of lawsuits.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I mean, honestly, the mental model I have, which is just a guess, and honestly, in answer to everyone's FAQ about where things are going, I think everyone's just guessing because no one has any actual idea. But I do think, and I do kind of hope that these tools will certainly make us humans more productive first before it starts to take away opportunities from us. And I mean, case in point to my narrative earlier about using ChatGPT kind of daily, or at least anytime I'm doing something technical, it's probably been saving me minutes, if not hours already. And so just like the logical extension of that is that I can now like start and finish this project today instead of starting it today and finishing it tomorrow. And so I'm already probably saving some cycles, and I think that's just kind of exciting because even within CS50's repositories on GitHub, we have dozens, maybe even hundreds of opened issues and feature requests to ourselves, or from other people that, realistically, they've been just sitting there for years because we just don't have the bandwidth, or they're lower priority, even though they might be interesting than other things. But if like AI could just kind of speed things up, we can start churning through things. And to your point about doing things that are intellectually interesting, spending a lot more time on that aspect of things.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It saves a ton of time, and I think the thing that I think about is this parallels to me closely to the evolution from assembly to high level language. And when assembly became supplanted by high-level language, I think we just saw more software being created, and there are certain things that wouldn't have been possible physically, um, reasonably in assembly, like modern operating systems. And I think we're potentially, especially as these tools develop, on the cusp of new projects of this endeavor that get created that allow people to just accomplish more with the same amount of time versus necessarily those people, leaving. I think it's going to raise the bar a little bit for, I think, what your average developer is going to have to do to be able to do in order to use these tools effectively. But I don't think that's going to be a problem. I think people are going to, as long as firms have goals that they want to achieve that are achievable via software, I think that this is just going to expand that space out more.
Yeah, I do. I do think I agree. I'm definitely on that side of the fence. Well, I'm mindful of the time here, Colton. But if you have time, I'm thinking we could do what like the late night talk shows sometimes do, and just kind of break things into two parts. If you have some more time to spend with us, because we have a whole bunch of questions in front of me that we can start hitting you with, if you're up for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and Max and Vlad, who are here with me off camera, if you guys are okay with this, what I think we should do, Colton, is probably pretend that we're taking a break, but really I'm just going to say this is the end of part one, and then we'll dive immediately into part two, so we don't take too much time from folks who are online live.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's pretend to say, all right, well, that's it for part one with CS50's own Colton Ogden, but we'll be back in just a bit for part two, wherein we dive all the more into your questions.
Cool. See you soon.
All right, now let's wait a moment, take a breath. Max, Vlad, we can forge ahead. At some point, Colton, I might have to extend my parking when my phone starts beeping, just FYI, if that happens live here. But,
oh, sure, yeah.
All right. All right, we are back, and this is part two of CS50's Office Hours with CS50's own Colton Ogden, whom you may know from such courses as CS50G, CS50's Introduction to Game Development using 2D and 3D graphics. And Colton, this is actually a frequently asked question from folks. What's the plan for CS50G? Where do you see it going, particularly since we last filmed it a few years back now?
So you and I did have a conversation about this relatively recently, and I think that there is going to be an iteration on it at some point. Exactly when, I think that's still to be decided. But I know that we're considering potentially getting rid of the 3D stuff in lieu of more 2D stuff, or perhaps changing some of that stuff around a little bit. But in terms of timelines and whatnot, nothing's decided. But I do think that, yeah, a refresh of sorts. You and I have started chatting about that, so it seems likely at this point.
And Love 2D has evolved a little bit in terms of version numbers, and so we fixate on a slightly older version in the class. Is CS50G something someone should still dive into so long as they install the right software, or is it starting to drift too out of date, do you think?
I don't think Love is too out of date. I think the issue more so is Unity. Unity's more of the headache, I think, in that course, with how we are very specifically tied to the older version of that, and also Blender. I think that Love itself, API-wise, hasn't changed too much. We did have to do the 10.2 or 3 to 11 point something slight adjustment at one point, but I think that now we're still in the 11.x series, and I don't think there's been any major changes to that. But yeah, if we do make the refresh, I think it would be a good idea to probably consider getting to the most current up-to-date version at that point and making whatever necessary code changes are relevant.
I agree. It's funny. Something similar happened to us years ago when we had a mobile class that was taught by Jordan Hayashi, which was focusing on React Native at the time. And prior to that, Dan Armendar is a former CS50 team member, and myself used to teach here at Harvard Extension School for adult students courses on iOS. We had Android in there too, and just that space, especially mobile, just changes so quickly, or at least has over the past several years. The courses were just out of date by the next term. And even when we weren't necessarily filming them, we were having to update half of the class every semester. And I still remember there was one year with iOS, I forget what year it was, but it's a few years ago, whereby a week before this lecture was going to happen, Apple's WWDC conference happened, the Worldwide Developers Conference, wherein they announced ARC, Automatic Reference Counting, which is a fancy way of saying memory management for what was Objective-C still at the time. And this was an entire week or two of the course, including the assignment, where you had to manage your own memory. And the fact that they had just now baked this into Xcode, which is the IDE that comes with Macs for iOS and macOS development, just kind of took the rug out from an intellectually interesting topic, but one that you don't really need to deal with anymore. And so it was just a constant race to keep up. So I totally get the constraints that we've run into with using sort of the latest and greatest with some stuff like 3D.
Yeah, mobile's particularly a pretty egregious environment, I think, when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, among the other questions, folks, Colton, that folks have for you, Colton, are what programming languages should people master after finishing something like CS50 itself, which teaches primarily, of course, C, Python, bit of SQL, bit of JavaScript?
So this is an interesting question. Programming languages to me, I think somebody's time is best spent learning not necessarily like with the goal of just a bunch of languages to put on a resume, but I think languages that are different in really fundamental ways to allow you to think more about ways to solve problems. So rather than, for example, going from C and maybe learning C++ and then Go and then Rust, although I think Rust is cool and has its own cool ideas, it probably is more beneficial for somebody to go from, let's say C to something like Java to get used to an object-oriented language, then learn something like Haskell to get used to a pure functional language, maybe learn a Lisp, and then maybe get into something like Rust in a different kind of high-level language, or low-level, high-level language. I think that there's value in trying to expand your scope of languages more than it is necessarily to get the number higher, because that might not mean a whole lot,
In
at least in my
scope of
opinion.
languages, you like types of languages,
Yeah,
features of?
programming paradigms. Like I think
Yeah.
having a good coverage of programming paradigms under one's tool belt and being able to think about different ways to solve programming problems is going to be more valuable to somebody than just if they know 3 procedural languages or 5 or 10
Yeah.
procedural languages, but they've never touched a functional or object-oriented language. I think there's more value into the latter, personally.
Yeah, those are exactly the paradigms that we encourage undergrads at Harvard and Yale to consider taking after CS50 if they're going to take another CS class, so that you kind of round out your approaches to problem solving. Like functional programming language, object-oriented programming language is kind of a good way to supplement what is largely procedural in CS50 via C. And even though Python does have some functional features, has some OO features, we as a class certainly don't really focus on that or distinguish it from the prior several weeks of C. But spending more time, I think, does have value
I think it
for
would be
folks out
hard
there.
it would be hard to rigorously do that, I think, in a course like that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. A lot of intro CS classes actually start with languages like Java and maybe Python, but they're sort of, and actually there's this expression in CS education of objects first. And I've actually personally never liked this. Like years ago, I did co-teach a class that was an intro to CS using Java, and I kind of hated, honestly, that like even just to print out hello world, you needed a class hello and public static void main. And they thankfully, years after Java came out, they finally eliminated that requirement where you can actually write something like hello world or simple functions without the need for a class. So I'm less annoyed by this now, but people have been moving on to other languages for intro CS classes too, among them Python anyway.
It's a syntax overload, especially with Java. Java is one of the most bulky languages that exists, but I think it's useful to learn, to understand.
Yeah.
And there's other languages that exist on the JVM that are cool. Like Clojure is a Lisp that I personally like that's on the JVM, and you can tie into Java's libraries with it. But to have somebody who's never programmed in a programming language go straight to Java, public static void main, all that stuff, it's just, and they have a wrap in a class, even though it's not the requirement anymore, but historically it was. It is definitely, I think, a lot more to take in. That's tough for somebody as opposed to just here's C, here's your int main, and then that's it, or void main, and then print line or printf hello world.
Yeah, I agree. And even beyond the annoying syntax, just like objects in my mind have always been like a solution to a problem. And we start to feel that, I think, partway through CS50. And case in point, when we get to like week 5 and we're introducing type def and struct in particular, where you want to encapsulate multiple pieces of data, like then objects can kind of swoop in, not in C, but some other language, as a solution to a problem. But I always hated that you have to start thinking about objects and properties and instantiating them before like those are actually clearly solutions to problems that would be harder or more annoying to solve without those features. So I kind of like the more historical progression of starting with, frankly, older languages moving into newer ones, because you see the motivation for it and you appreciate what and how those problems were solved.
I agree. It does feel like Java is kind of an iteration as an object-oriented language on top of a procedural language. So learning C, you're essentially just going in and adding a few new pieces to C when you learn Java, as opposed to if
Yeah.
you were to learn Java and then go to learn C or the like, and you're taking away essentially things, minus the memory stuff. But
Yeah. And Colton, a question just came in the YouTube live chat, which is to one, compliment you. This student took CS50G a year ago, loved it, but they wanted to get your thoughts on the recent layoffs in the gaming and tech space. Any advice you have for people going to looking to get into game dev specifically?
Gaming and tech space. Well, I haven't looked too deeply into it to comment, I think, on a meaningful level quantitatively, but I think what I like to see now is that the indie game industry is pretty popular. The only thing that kind of sucks about that is that because it's popular, it's also harder to make a solid living on something like that. I think the games industry in and of itself is pretty competitive and pretty rough, I think, especially for somebody just entering the space. So I didn't pursue that as a main avenue for programming. It was a hobby of mine, a passion of mine. But it's one of those things where I think if you want to make it in games, you're going to have to be really kind of brutal with how much time that you spend on doing it and how aggressive you are doing it in order to stand out. That's the impression that I get. Versus if you go into another sector like data science or web, I think your options are a lot more open, and these kinds of things aren't happening as frequently, it seems like. But games are rough. The benefit of games is that you do have a pretty easy way of at least getting a game that you complete out in front of people with platforms like Steam or Epic Game Store. But that requires you to put yourself into a environment like that where you're now in a sea of options, and so your marketing skills then have to be really good. So there's not really, I don't think there's really an easy answer other than either really be willing to commit like a lot of time and energy to being really aggressive in the workforce, or try and eke out a game probably as a side gig in conjunction with maybe a different sector of programming, instead of doing it, as through a AAA studio or the like. But yeah.
And more broadly in the tech sector, do all of the layoffs that people keep reading about in the world from some of the larger tech companies especially worry you? Or do you think this is just more of a natural correction to the COVID time craziness?
It could be that. I mean, if it's a FANG sector, like if it's those kinds of companies that are really laying people off, I mean, I don't really pay too close attention to it, to be honest. So I think that it's something that my opinion on it's probably not informed enough to give a really nuanced take on it. But I mean, there's I think probably a lot of companies out there that are not FANG that are looking for help, and people I
Yeah.
think tend to go for FANG first, whereas it might be beneficial for people to stop having this dream or aspiration that they have to be a Silicon Valley 180K software developer and consider other options instead. I think that might
Yeah.
be a more optimistic outlook for people.
Well, and it is worth noting, I think, that in 2020, 2021, where the entire world was shifting online, there was a crazy amount of hiring and competitive hiring at some of those larger companies. And so even though it feels like a huge number of people are getting laid off suddenly, which is true in absolute numbers, like if we probably did plot like what the trajectory looked like, it's really correcting the behavior or the overly enthusiastic hiring that happened in some of these companies over the past few years. So
Yeah,
maybe
that
this
would
is a
that would make
healthier
sense.
correction anyway.
Just a market correction in general.
Doesn't help eliminate any of the short-term stress, but I don't think, to our conversation earlier about AI, that it's necessarily discouraging long-term of the folks going into tech, since I think the world's only going to get even more technical over time.
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah, I would be hard pressed to believe that these layoffs were even directly related to the AI stuff. I don't think it's not the token context limit's too short to allow if these big companies are trying to automate all that stuff. I don't think they're able to automate achievably anything huge. I think they're still,
Yeah.
yeah.
And this is a little general, but I love how it's phrased. Do we need to learn all the things? Or is it okay to Google things often and learn as you need?
I personally have never liked the idea of just cram and learn a bunch of things before actually applying that skill, especially with something like programming. I mean, this applies to language too. Like, you don't just learn a language before you actually use it in consumption or talking with other people in the context of natural languages. And I think this applies to programming very well because it's a skill that you actually have to use in order to cement and crystallize the concepts. Like, you can learn what an if statement is and what a loop is, what an object is, all these different constructs. But if you've not used it and actually solved a problem with it, I feel like the actual problem solving is an emergent property of using it in an applied context that you can't get from using it from just cramming and learning all of the things, so to speak. I think you have to realistically to become a good programmer, you have to use it as you're learning, and I think you should do it as quickly as possible. And I think CS50 obviously uses this philosophy because you're giving people an assignment right out the gate, even in Scratch, week one, week
Mm-hmm.
zero. Folks have to use it. It's okay to be sort of not fully versed in what you're using and not have all of the knowledge and be imperfect in that sense. But I mean, cycling back to GPT-4, like you now have the ability to so quickly iterate and learn and get feedback on your own shortcomings in a way that we've never had in history before. So this is really the best time to be alive to learn new things and to apply them at the same time. But I would not ever espouse the idea of learning upfront and not using it in an applied sense. Try to solve problems like day one, try to write something, and then just keep doing that every day. But always keep learning. Don't fall off and only also do applied stuff and just stagnate at a certain level of skill. Like keep growing and challenging yourself, I would say too.
Yeah, and I think related to that is this phrase that some folks cite online of tutorial hell, where you just go from tutorial to tutorial to tutorial, or even in CS50's case, like going from CS50 course to CS50 course to CS50 course. Like at some point, there's surely diminishing returns of doing things more academically or in terms of tutorials. And I think to your point earlier, it's really important as soon as you can to like go do something of interest to you, like go write a game that's of interest, go automate some task in your home, go like, work on some student project with others that's just interesting to you that no professor asked you to do per se.
Yeah, I have friends who are starting in computer science, and they are telling me how they're learning stuff, and I keep giving them advice and saying, "Hey, you got to actually use this and make something, or you're not going to be as good as you think you'll be to get a job at the end of this. Like you need to be competitive and get a job, because there are people that don't study that do a lot of the applied work and learn a lot of the
Yeah.
same things and just are better at doing the actual work. You have to put in the time both in learning and in the applied sense. And you should ideally be studying computer science with goals in mind. Like when I started studying programming, it was because I wanted to make games. Like ideally, I mean, people have to choose a career path, and I totally understand that as well. But if that's the mindset that you're operating under, I would encourage you to consider what sort of path interests you in programming the most. Like what do you like? Do you like websites? Do you like games? Do you like what gets you excited? And try to move in that direction and let that inform how you spend your time in an applied sense.
Yeah.
The sooner you ask yourself these questions and get working on it, I think the sooner you put yourself on a path to be more competitive in the workplace.
Well, because in terms of programming in particular, I mean, honestly, I'm out of college 25 some years now, but the only software classes really that I took were, of course, CS50. There's another class at Harvard called CS51, which, to Colton's point earlier, teaches functional programming and a bit of object-oriented programming as well. And then I took a course on operating systems, which was like lower level system stuff where we learned some C++ and really learned, frankly, for me out of that class, how to collaborate with a partner because you were allowed to work in pairs because the homework assignments were so darn big. Like you kind of had to split it up per the course's structure. And that was kind of it. Like I took, another dozen or two courses in CS, some of which did have programming in them or certainly assignments that involved code. But I'm not sure the returns were nearly as high as those first 2 or 3 classes. And ever since, it really has been, in my case, like texting Colton in recent years or instant messaging friends when I have questions about languages. That's how I taught myself PHP, was just messaging a friend back and forth, back and forth. It's pretty much how I learned Python. It's pretty much how I'm sure I'll learn the next language, is just asking lots of questions, although now it will probably be the duck or a chatbot that replies
Yeah,
instead of a human
computer.
friend. But I think this is to say just like how enabling CS and programming is. And I think once you do have an understanding of some of the fundamentals, so you can sort of reason from first principles as to how some technology works or why some bug might be happening, like you're just a smarter person in general, and you don't have to necessarily have everything handed to you in the form of a course or tutorial for much longer after that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think now, especially like you just mentioned, GPT-4 is a great jumping off point to allow you to dig deeper, but the sooner you can start solving problems, that's the whole point of it. That's the whole goal. It's like
Yeah.
when you're learning a natural language, the goal is to use it to talk to people or to consume content. And a lot of people will make the same mistake learning a language like Japanese. They won't actually learn how to use it or how to read something. They'll just cram all the characters and spend years and years doing this and not actually getting much better at the language. And I think the same thing applies with programming and computer science.
It's funny you mentioned because my mind immediately goes to years ago when I enrolled just for fun in an Italian class at night through Harvard's Extension School, the continuing ed program, and parlo un po' italiano, but which is to say I only speak a little Italian. But I remember distinctly being in this class of mostly adults who were just doing it for their own edification as well, not part of some formal schooling. And many of them, if not most of them, were taking this intro to Italian class specifically because they wanted to go out to dinner in the north end of Boston, which is the Italian section of the city, or they wanted to travel somewhere in Italy and actually be able to speak the language. And so like it was very much motivated by practical application of the theory, so to speak. And the
Yep.
returns of that first class were, for many of them, super high. Higher for them than for me, since I used most of my vocabulary a moment ago.
That's all right.
And Colton, one question that came up in the chat too, a couple of ways, is about blockchain. Like, what do you think about blockchain and blockchain dev? We within CS50's ecosystem don't currently have a course on such and no plans for such, but I wonder what you think of it because just a few years ago, it's all anyone was talking about. Then somehow the world switched, or at least Facebook switched to the metaverse for a couple of years. And now, of course, everyone's talking about AI. And it just kind of feels like whiplash back and forth every couple of years. And I do think for folks who are just trying to get into this world, or younger students or older students who don't have much CS experience, it feels like you can't possibly keep up with all of these trends, blockchain among them.
So blockchain to me feels very faddish, especially the NFT craze that we had. I'm not sure how I see the longevity of blockchain. Now, the technology might have application beyond the recent fads, but I think we're going to see, and I think we've seen a downsurge in the popularity of that quite a bit. Um, People regret obviously not buying Bitcoin when Bitcoin was popular, but I don't know how much of all of this, and I'm relatively naive to a lot of this stuff and applications outside of NFTs, and how it's useful in modern society, I suppose. But in terms of just technology, it's an inevitable part of being a software developer is you're going to have to learn a lot of different things. You're going to have to acclimate, and again, it kind of comes back to GPT-4. Like we have this amazing tool now that allows people to get instant sort of personalized responses to this stuff, clarification on how to use it or how it works, anything related to this technology that otherwise would have been many hours, days, weeks of studying this stuff. So I think I would still encourage people who are having misgivings about just the sheer scope of what they need to catch up, just use, GPT-4 and use that as an initial jumping off point for folks that are getting into software development. Get used to using that to explore these topics that you're unsure about, and save yourself this time. And this because the sooner you do it for longer, the easier it will be in the long haul, I think, versus traditionally, at least when I was learning all this stuff, I was using Google, and people didn't have Google, in the early 90s, late 80s.
Dude, we
So
were using Alta Vista for the older students in the crowd here who might know that one.
was that an online service or is that a
Yeah, it was
CD?
it was like the best search engine before Google came along. So in like 97, 98, early 99, like the
Oh,
cool
I see.
kids were using altavista.com.
I think we used InfoSeek in my household.
Yeah, that's another flashback. Somehow Yahoo of all of them is still around, though not really something people seem to reach for.
Yeah, Yahoo's, and I know CS50 used Yahoo Finance for. Do you guys still use Yahoo Finance for the finance
We
problems?
do. We went back to Yahoo Finance because they shut off the CSV feed that we were relying on for a while. And then we went to some third-party APIs who very generously tended to have free plans, but they would sometimes go down and they would sometimes change the free plans to a paid plan. So thankfully, Yahoo now supports CSV again.
No, they still have a use case then.
Yes, at least for that. And actually, it's funny enough, like Yahoo Finance itself as a website has really nice charts for interactivity and visualization. So I do think they should keep that going.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. I guess yeah. To circle back though, yeah, I would say the fear of the sheer quantity of stuff, I think, is a common experience for people getting into computer science. It's probably a common experience in most fields that are, that have a lot in them, especially for someone going into like a master's or PhD even. I think that there's just a lot, and it changes quickly, like we talked about, like you mentioned with mobile stuff, but it's something I think that folks just have to commit to a little bit. it's something that has to be an active process, because I think it's
Mm-hmm.
easy to fall behind and not pay attention to things that are happening and just allow things to pass you by. And then months and months have gone by and now you're behind. Like folks that aren't familiar with Copilot and using Copilot already or GPT, I think should start using it ASAP, because this technology is only going to become more sophisticated and more useful. And this applies to any, I think, tool that takes on major usage. It's just something that is part of the commitment to programming and computer science. So hopefully folks are interested in that sort of thing, because it's something that you're going to have to do a lot.
Yeah, really well said. Well, I think we have time for about 3 more questions, one of which I can pluck off. In the chat is not only a whole bunch of Italian now, but also a question about whether there will be a CS50 Java class. No plans just yet, but I mentioned to some folks online the other day that it's something we are thinking about. So keep the inquiries coming if that too would be of interest. The most upcoming course of CS50s is going to be Carter's CS50R. And frequently asked question today online has been, what does the R stand for? Well, it stands for R, which itself is a programming language super common in data science and anything involving statistics and analytics of data. So if you want to learn how to program in that language, join us soon for Carter's class. But back to Colton, 2 final questions for you. This again brings us full circle to the AI space. So with so many LLMs, large language models coming up, at what point do we stop programming with programming languages and just use natural language to tell computers what we want them to do you think?
So we touched on this a little bit actually already, but in my mind, so currently as they exist, they're probabilistic token generators. And as long as they stay that way, I think it's going to be impossible for certain sectors, especially, to just completely automate away the development of software architectures. Because right now, I could envision, especially even with the token limit right now, if somebody were to create a way to word a prompt and do a series of API calls to generate very devised little chunks of code that are pure functional, that have a contract, and the top level contract assumes a certain way, and all of the subcomponents get broken down into a recursive process. You could generate theoretically, even with a small token limit, a software piece of software that does something, and then generate the test for it and automate that. But is it going to work exactly the way you want it to work? And also, people generate software and then they inevitably want things changed, and it's very hard to do that with LLMs right now, especially if you were to theoretically do this recursive process and generate this massive software architecture that was like 100, 200,000 lines of code. You're not feeding that in any meaningful way into an LLM to do an analysis to generate a solution to fix a problem that's multifaceted across your code base. Um, so you're going to need humans, and also it's not necessarily going to always be correct, and certain industries can harbor that risk more than others. An e-learning platform like the one that I work on isn't as high risk as a piece of, like I mentioned before, medical software that's responsible for administering medication to somebody. And these things are not going to be intelligently fully automated at any point in the near future, as long as those companies don't want to get sued into oblivion. So I think we're going to have people using the software, using programming languages, even in the worst, like most dystopian scenario where everything's getting fully automated and generated. You're still going to need people to correct the code, if it and do a check on it to make sure it's correct for high risk. And you're also going to need people that are capable of changing the code and understanding the code, because there's not currently a way to easily, that I can conceive of with current token limitations and even foreseeably larger token generations, doing an adjustment on this code base and getting it right. That's my current thought on it. So I think it's going to be relevant for quite a long time for programming languages.
Nice. Well said. Thank you for that perspective, too. It's good that we have just time for one more question, because the battery on the phone here is dying. And in fact, you're getting more and more pixelated, as I think the iPhone is struggling to keep up. So this one I asked somewhat playfully, but it is from our live YouTube chat, Colton. I actually don't know how to answer it, but it's a good one for Google or ChatGPT after this. So I'll be amazed if you can answer it. But if not, we'll end on a fun note. Quote unquote, not to be too technical, how does IPFS, interplanetary file systems, work?
Is that like Jeff Bezos's is Blue, whatever that program is that
I'm not sure. I would Google if as a next
he's
step.
he's building like an AWS for like planetary payload sort of logistics between like the moon and Earth and other asteroids and stuff in the
Oh,
solar system.
interesting.
Per his recent
Small
interview
user
on.
base initially, I would think.
Yeah, very very small user base. That's the only thing I can imagine, the interplanetary file system. I'm excited to see it,
It
but
sounds
maybe it has
amazing,
a
and
maybe it has a different meaning that's not the literal planetary. I'm not familiar with
it.
it, obviously. I'm partially joking with all this, but
Well, it'd be nice to think that this will be a problem we need to solve soon. I did rewatch the movie Interstellar recently, which is amazing. If no one's seen Interstellar, such good music, such good cinematography, storyline.
saw it in
But
theaters. Did you see it in theaters?
I didn't. No, I haven't seen a movie in theaters in years, actually, thanks
Oh,
to
this
COVID
was
and
a while
such.
ago, I think. What was the last movie you
Yeah.
saw in theaters? Do you remember?
Oh my gosh, I don't. It's that long ago. I'll have to check my calendar, see if I wrote it down somewhere, but I probably wouldn't have.
It's been a while for me too.
Yeah.
I understand.
Well, just as the battery's trailing off, I feel like so are we. So we should probably end on this note. The last movie we can't remember we saw. But
Yeah.
Colton, thank you so much. You are totally missed by the whole team here. It's not quite the same video conferencing alone as having you down the hall from here.
Oh, I missed you guys too. This was great. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, this is super cool. Hope we can do it again sometime.
Love to. And thanks so much to everyone who's been joining us live. In answer to one other FAQ, yes, we will post the recordings of both part 1 and part 2 online shortly on multiple platforms. Thanks so much to CS50's own Vladimir and Max, who have been helping run things behind the scenes. And extra special thanks to Colton. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Thanks so much.
This was CS50.